have a shot spotter activation. Single gunshot detected. There's your location. Send a team.
Poacher spotted.
Okay, great. That was really, really cool. Everybody in the office is incredibly awed by that video. So yeah, Ian, take it away.
Cool, excellent. Thank you very much, Erin, for inviting us. It's always a pleasure to chat to like-minded people about, I suppose, an issue that we become deeply passionate about. And I will confess that since we've been involved in this project since 2013, rhino conservation is more than just a technological project for us. It becomes an obsession, and I think anybody involved in rhino conservation and anti-poaching can attest to the fact as to how it gets under your skin when you've had the displeasure of actually seeing what happens to these animals, and in many cases when they're not yet dead, you feel like you just have to do something. And I'll start off with a quote by a fellow called Edmund Burke, who you may know, but he had a great quote which said, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." And we felt compelled as an organization and as people to apply our minds to this problem and hopefully bring some technological advantages to the men and the women who literally break their backs every single day to protect the species from extinction. And it truly is a privilege for us to be involved in this project. And we've met probably the most amazing people I've ever had the pleasure of working with. And I mean that sincerely. So yeah, having said that as an introduction, I'll give you a brief introduction to the company and the technology and our role in that. So I'm the chief executive of a company called Beyond Wireless. And we really apply which you've probably heard the acronym. It's the Internet of Things, which is the ability to use the cell phone networks and technology to remotely monitor assets and equipment all around the world. Currently, we operate in 74 countries, predominantly working in the healthcare sector with the likes of UNICEF, the Red Cross, and the WHO. But we've become particularly good at making technology work in particularly difficult places. So the background and the story to ShotSpotter is back in 2013. My team and I, we on a monthly basis get around the table and we ask ourselves the question: how can we apply technology to solve difficult problems, and what problems are there that need solving? And the issue of rhino poaching, obviously, as a South African, it's been top of our mind. Certainly, those who are involved in the conservation sector for a long time. And one of the guys stood up and said, "Well," and I suppose this is the link to acoustics. He said, "Well, what if we could hear the shot?" And it was an intriguing idea. And as a team of engineers, we said, "Well, I'm sure we could build something like that." And then I said, "Well, before we build something like that, let's rather Google it." So we Googled gunshot detection, and up popped the name ShotSpotter. And I immediately got on the phone and I called the CEO of ShotSpotter, who's based in Silicon Valley in the US. His name is Ralph Clark. And I said to Ralph, we have this issue with rhino poaching. And at that stage, the ShotSpotter technology, which has been around for just over 2 decades, had primarily been developed and utilized in an urban gunfire environment. So the technology is used to detect urban gunfire, and in South Africa, we also have the technology deployed in the Cape Flats. So in Hanover Park and Manenberg, which are areas typically noted for gang violence and gang-related violence, and we've also more recently deployed it in the suburb of Helenvale, in Port Elizabeth. But those are both urban environment, or all urban environments. And the question we had to ask ourselves is, can we make this technology work in the bush? Because the bush quite clearly is a very different environment to what a city is in every aspect. Yeah, and the question was, A, could we make it work? Because obviously in a city you have power, in the bush you don't have power. And the other thing that we needed is reliable connectivity. And quite obviously in the city, you've got 3G and 4G and LTE and various other things. And in the bush, you don't necessarily have the luxury of reliable and stable and high-speed communications. Nonetheless, Ralph Clark, who's become a very good and close friend of mine since we started this in 2013, he very graciously said, well, I tell you what, Ian, I'm going to send you 10 sensors. And if you can make it work in the bush, well, maybe we've got something that we could talk about. So the 10 sensors arrived, and the first thing we had to do was to get the sensors to operate in the bush. So we had to solve the issue of power. Fortunately, in South Africa, we're blessed with very good sunshine for the vast majority of the time. So that was a relatively easy issue to solve. And we had to also solve the issue of connectivity. And again, GSM connectivity is fairly ubiquitous, and particularly in the Kruger, where you have a lot of tourist activity. So cell phone connectivity was available to us. We tested the technology back in 2013, really developing what we described as a technical proof of concept. We have had absolutely no aspirations of any sort of operational success. We were there to see if it would work. And very interestingly, not only did the technology work technologically, in fact, what we did is we fired, well, let me just explain quickly how the technology works. So a gunshot is very much like a pebble being dropped in a pond. So as the weapon is fired, the acoustic wave travels outwards from the center, as I said, very much like the ripples traveling through the ponds when you drop a pebble in. As that impulsive noise, the boom, the pop, or the bang that is generated by that firearm arrives at each one of the sensors, we're able to date and timestamp the arrival of that sensor. And because the sensors are all placed in a slightly different location, the time of arrival is slightly different at each one of the sensors. That difference in the time of arrival allows us to calculate distance. And basic high school mathematics, distance from 3 or more points is effectively a dot on the map. So we were able to prove that the technology was able to reliably and accurately detect gunfire. We then had to ask ourselves the question, well, what kind of gunfire will it detect? And of course, when poachers are poaching rhinos, they typically use very heavy caliber weapons, 375, 458. But we went through literally an exhaustive exercise of firing multiple caliber of weapon, all the way from 223 up to 458, both suppressed and unsuppressed weapons, because poachers are known to use suppressors, or what you might refer to as silencers. Of course, it's very difficult to silence a heavy caliber weapon. And what we proved to ourselves during that technical proof of concept is that not only could we detect gunfire, but we could detect it at far greater ranges and with higher degree of accuracy than we were able to do in the traditional urban environment that ShotSpotter was designed to operate in. And in retrospect, it made sense in the sense that the bush, by its nature, is a lot quieter than a typical urban environment. You don't have the same noises that you would have associated with human activity, cars, aircraft, construction work, and the likes. And of course, the bush has the other advantage of having no hard objects in the way, like tall buildings, roads, and other hard things that are going to bounce and refract and bend sound around. So we were able to prove that with a very high degree of reliability and accuracy, we were able to detect and locate gunfire. Very interestingly, during the technical proof of concept, and I remember the incident extremely well. It was on the 9th of April in 2014. I was sitting at home in Joburg. We had conducted all of our tests, and I got a message on my phone because the alerts come through via SMS and on the app. And a shot had been fired at 8:30 at night inside our test array, which was not known as a hotspot at that stage. And to cut a very long story short, with absolutely no intention of ever catching a poacher, we actually caught 2 of them at that particular incident. And I think that got everybody to sit up straight in the sense that not only were we able to prove to ourselves and to our partners, both in the Kruger and in the US, that we were able to technically detect and locate gunfire, but we were also able to turn that into operational success with an arrest. And in that case, it happened to be 2 poachers who were caught as a result of that particular incident. So to fast forward, like all projects, there is a requirement for money. So we then had to go out and seek some funding. And again, to cut a very long story short, we were able to secure a donation from some philanthropists in the US. And that allowed us to expand the technology to where it is today, and I can't tell you where or how much, but nonetheless, we have a fairly significant deployment inside the Kruger National Park, which has been operating there for just short of 2 years. And we've had a fairly successful time during that period. Where not only have we been successful in arresting poachers, but I think more importantly than that, what we've proven is that, and this is one of the criticisms of ShotSpotter, certainly in the early days, what they said was that once the shot has been fired, it's probably too late because an animal has died. And while we accept that to be the reality, we also know that there is nothing more powerful in terms of a deterrent than an effective response. Because what we know from rhino poaching, and I think Debbie will attest to this, is that the vast majority of gunshots go undetected, and in many cases you find a carcass which is hours or days or sometimes even weeks old, and the poacher has already gone home, sold his product, and may have already come back a few times to get some more rhino horn in the interim. So the ability to detect and locate gunfire within a short period of time and to give an accurate location means that rangers and anti-poaching authorities are able to respond with greater speed and greater accuracy than ever made possible before. And as a result of that effective response, and we've certainly seen this, is able to drive reductions in the number of animals killed inside our coverage area, because we believe that while the poachers may not know exactly what is resulting in the enhanced and improved response, they are certainly aware of it. And we notice that they now appear to be deliberately avoiding the area as a result of the technology. So I'm just going to pull up a very quick slide here just to explain how it works. Again, I promise I'm not going to bore you with any PowerPoint, but in essence, just to explain how the software works. That I suppose is a pitiful depiction of the bush, but nonetheless, you've got the bush, and in the bush you have lots of trees, and of course the trees suit us in that they give us the opportunity to mount the sensors. So quite literally what we did is we gave the trees ears and allowed them to listen to what was happening in that environment. Now ShotSpotter specifically listens for what we call impulsive noises, so booms, pops, and bangs. So you have rhino living in this area, and when a poacher fires that weapon, that acoustic wave travels outwards, it arrives at each one of the sensors. As I said earlier, we're able to date and timestamp the arrival of that boom, bang, or pop, and the difference in the time of arrival allows us to calculate distance, and distance from 3 or more points is a dot in a map. The sensors then upload that information via the cell phone network, which then lands up on the servers. The servers run the algorithm to calculate the location, and then to give a weighting in terms of to what extent does this noise actually sound like gunfire. Of course, having the heavy caliber weapons that we have in the Kruger, are you guys able to see my screen?
No, we're not. Sorry.
Oh, my apologies. Sorry. Okay, so I'm just going to have to rewind that. Let me just share my screen then. My humble apologies. Okay, there we go. There
we go. Perfect.
Okay, great. So let me just go back then. Okay, so there's the bush, sensors in the trees, rhinos living in the bush, and of course a poacher fires that weapon. Acoustic wave travels outwards from the center. We transmit that information via the local cell phone network onto our servers, which essentially calculate the location through a form of triangulation. But then we still have to go through what we call the review process. Now, as good as computers are, and artificial intelligence and machine learning, etc., we are yet to perfect a machine quite as amazing as the human brain. And in the review center, we have trained acoustic experts who quite literally have listened to tens of thousands of rounds of gunfire, and they verify what the computers say is likely to be a shot. Very interestingly, in the Kruger, and we only picked this up afterwards, is that elephants feeding, in other words, breaking and pushing over trees and snapping branches, often to both the human ear and to our system, can sometimes sound like gunfire. And I think anybody who's been involved in anti-poaching and has ever heard elephants breaking trees, rangers are often fooled by that and think it might be a shot that's been fired. But nonetheless, through the machine learning algorithms, we were able to filter those out. And every now and then we get a false positive, but nonetheless, the human ear is responsible for verifying whether or not that noise is in fact a gunshot. Once we have that, the system then publishes that information to what we call the alerts console, which sits in a control room. The operator sitting in front of that screen will then relay the coordinates of that shot directly to the rangers, and at the same time, we send out an SMS alert as well as an app alert, which provides the latitude and longitude of that shot. The responding rangers are also able to listen to the sound of that shot, because that provides additional situational awareness, which is sometimes useful. And although it has never happened in the Kruger, but certainly in an urban environment, if a law enforcement officer were to hear, for example, multiple shooters or automatic gunfire, that would certainly dictate a different response to what you would do if you had a single gunshot with a single shooter. As I said, that has certainly never happened in the Kruger. Most shots or incidents are typically a single shot, maybe a second one or a third one if they don't kill the animal with the first shot. But nonetheless, it's typically bolt-action rifle fire out of high-caliber weapons with a relatively low cadence. That information and the speed with which it gets relayed to the responding rangers and or law enforcement officers, the whole transaction, and I call it a transaction, but the transaction from the moment the trigger is pulled and the weapon is fired to the point where that information arrives on the handset of a responding ranger, that entire transaction takes between 30 and 45 seconds. So that means within 30 to 45 seconds, we have the exact location of the incident, and that, for obvious reasons, radically improves the probability of actually catching the bad guys red-handed. So yeah, and then you have your response, quite obviously, and that allows us to then hopefully interdict the poachers. So what I'm now going to show you, and then we can get into some questions if you have any. Again, I'm not going to zoom back or show you anything that I shouldn't, but essentially this is one of the incidents that we are most proud of in the Kruger. This happened in February of 2019, in the early days of our deployment. We had a shot that occurred at 15 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, which is quite unusual because most poachers tend to wait to last light. This particular incident, we got the location, and it just so happened that we already had helicopters in the air, and within 17 minutes of the shot being fired, we actually had these poachers in handcuffs. And it wasn't just any old poacher. It turned out to be one of the Kruger's most wanted and prolific poachers, a fellow who had been on their wanted list for a very long time, and he literally got caught red-handed, and is subsequently now awaiting trial. So the good news is that in the 18 or so months that we've been active in this particular area, we've had, I think, in the region now of 9 arrests, but more encouragingly, and this is truthfully the thing that we're after, we've actually noted a 60% reduction in the number of rhino carcasses inside that coverage area year on year since the deployment of the technology. And what we can only put that down to, just by virtue of the fact of the number of rhino that live in this particular location, it is a treasure trove from a gene pool perspective. But what we are putting it down to is that the bush telegraph works, and we think and we know that poachers have probably gotten wind of the fact that something, whether they know it specifically or not, but something has changed, and as a result of that, they seem to be staying away. And that for us has been probably the most successful thing of this project, is not that we catch bad guys, but that bad guys no longer come to the areas where these animals live. So so that I suppose in a brief way sums up what we do. And if you guys have any questions, I will just quickly play you. I'm not sure if you can hear the audio, but apart from the location, and I won't zoom out, there's actually the shot. I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but that is the impulsive noise that would obviously tell us that is a gunshot. And if we zoomed in, literally, and this is quite important as well, we use satellite imagery. Now, this doesn't particularly help you, I guess, but if you can see it, even the ability to spot landmarks. So we can see 2 large marula trees on the left-hand side there, and I'm able to actually walk the rangers in by using these tools. So I can say, as an example, 80 meters, 262 foot from the large marula tree northeast or northwest of the spot. And rangers who've been involved in these responses, and you can take it from them. You can speak to Don English and anybody involved in this this conservation area will know exactly who Don English is. He's the Numzan of the Kruger. He can tell you about an incident where we gave him a location and he literally went and stood on the bullet case. That gives you an idea of the accuracy that we're able to achieve with this acoustic technology.
Wow.
So,
Ian,
yeah.
We weren't able to see your thing earlier. If you could just share the right thing.
Sorry, let me help you with that. So let me just get back to that. I'll say stop sharing and let me share again. Sorry.
No, don't worry about it.
There we go. So I'll put that back up. Yeah, so there is the shot. And I'll just sort of clear this. So, so this is an actual incident. As I said, this is the one that resulted in the arrest of an extremely high profile poacher. And there you can see, just take that off. I'll zoom back slightly without giving away the system's location for obvious security reasons. But nonetheless, as I zoom in, you can sort of see a little marula tree there. And if we were directing a poacher onto the scene, aside from the fact that he has the exact latitude and longitude, which they can plug into their GPS, we can actually walk them in from landmarks in the particular area so they can literally go and stand on the bullet case. And the idea here is that, as much as you might find a carcass at that particular location, the carcass we refer to as the poo. If you can find the poo being the point of origin, that gives you the starting point. And from there, you're able to initiate the appropriate follow-up to be able to intercept and interdict these poachers. So I think that that probably sums up what it is that we do. So I'm now happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Well, thank you so much, Ian. That was amazing and very insightful. It is so amazing to see this kind of technology being implemented in one of our biggest and most beautiful national parks. And we're very grateful, obviously, for all the work you guys are doing in terms of keeping our natural resources safe. We do have a few questions, but how this is going to work is that after each talk, we're going to be having a short Q&A session with each of our presenters. And then at the end, we'll have a panel discussion where we can just discuss more general questions and how acoustics and conservation can really be used in very, very effective ways. So Ian, if you can stay right until the end of the session so we can include you in on that panel.
Absolutely.
So the first question that we have says, I'm not familiar with how rhinos get trafficked out of South Africa to market countries, but have you seen or do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic might reduce the market for rhino horn with potential benefits for rhino conservation? And related to this, has there been an increase or decrease like now during the pandemic?
Well, yeah, so that has actually been addressed by Minister Barbara Creasy. And to answer the question, well, certainly COVID-19, to our knowledge, has not reduced demand. Demand sits predominantly in Vietnam. So it's very difficult to comment as to what impact it has on the demand side. But of course, the lockdown of our borders and the restrictions of travel have impacted on the poachers' ability to move the product out of South Africa. So, and I think there was an article by Minister Creasy about a month and a half ago addressing specifically this, saying that we have seen a reduction in rhino poaching during lockdown. My personal concern, and this is a personal concern only, I'm not certainly speaking for the minister, quite obviously, but I have a personal concern that while we've had a lull in rhino poaching as a result of the restrictions on movement and therefore the ability to get the product out of the country, demand has not diminished. And what I think we all fear in this particular case is that poaching is likely to come back with a vengeance, as those who supply the product will seek to make up the lost time in their ability to fulfill the demand in the Far East. So, yeah, I think that perhaps answers your question. And therefore, all the more reason to have these, what we refer to as force multiplier technologies, because the conservation efforts, not only in the Kruger, but also in Traflui Umfolozi, who we've been down to see previously, there are limited resources in order to cover the ground. And any technological tool that can essentially enhance their capability, I think, will go a long way to making them a lot more effective than simply waiting to hear the shot or alternatively see the vultures the next morning.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question before we get, you have a lot of questions, so we're going to address those in the Q&A session at the end, or as many as we can, obviously to give everybody a chance. So the last question that we'll ask for now is, do you think that it will be possible to detect shot directions from the arrays that you use? And that was addressed by Conrad.
It is an estimate. So the short answer is yes. And the way we detect direction of fire, so firstly, we know the origin. Direction of fire is slightly more complex, although, and when I say complex, although it's not particularly important, because typically rhino poaching will happen at relatively close range, sort of anywhere between 10 and 50 meters. These guys are shooting at night. They're typically not using sophisticated optics, so they're not taking long range shots. But what we are able to deduce from what we refer to as sensor participation is that the muzzle, the acoustic energy, also referred to as the sound, quite obviously, is greater in front of the weapon. So in other words, if you've ever fired a rifle, you would notice that if you're behind the gun, it is significantly softer than it is if you're standing in front of the firearm. So what that means is acoustically, if we see we know the point of origin and we see more sensors participating on a particular side of that point of origin, we are able to with a fair degree of accuracy, detect the direction in which that weapon was being fired by virtue of the fact that more sensors in front of the gun are likely to hear it than sensors behind the gun, because that's just how a firearm works. So we can pick up direction of fire, but it's certainly not the kind of direction where you can say he fired at a 23 degrees from north. That's not the kind of accuracy that we're going to give you. So it's academically interesting, although operationally not that particularly relevant, because what you really want to know is where was he standing when he shot, because you're going to find a rhino if he's hit that animal within 30 to 40 meters of that location, unless of course the animal is wounded, in which case the animal will run. But nonetheless, by putting a ranger team on the point of origin, and if you're able to put dogs on that location, the dogs will be able to track that blood trail and therefore tell you where that rhino has gone, and also by virtue of the fact that poachers will probably follow that animal where the poachers have gone. So that is really the idea behind the system, is to give you that point of origin so you can mount an effective response very, very quickly from that location.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ian. That's all the questions. That's all the time we have for questions for now. But like I said, if you stay on until the question and answer panel discussion at the end, we have a lot of more questions that we can ask you then. Thank you so much for your time. Yes. Okay, we're going to move on to our next speaker, Gill Braulik, who's going to be talking more about acoustic monitoring of blast fishing, and this is work that has been done in Tanzania.
Hi everyone, my name is Gill Braulik. I'm a research fellow at the University of St Andrews, and I'm going to be talking today about acoustic monitoring of fishing with explosives. I'm going to outline 3 different studies that have used acoustics in different forms to document blast fishing in Tanzania, and we'll finish with a comparison of the advantages and disadvantages of each of these different approaches. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Jason Rubens, who is a marine manager based in Dar es Salaam, who's one of the founders of the Tanzanian Blast Monitoring Network and has been working on blast fishing for around 15 years, and Jamie McCauley, who's now based at Aarhus University in Denmark, who was heavily involved with lots of the technical aspects of the underwater acoustics and the analysis. Fishing using explosives is a quick and easy way to quickly harvest large amounts of fish. And despite it being illegal and dangerous, it's still a big problem in many parts of the world, including several countries in Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka. And in Tanzania is the only country in East Africa where this occurs. The force of the explosion kills everything in its wake, including both target and non-target species with little and young juvenile. And it can also damage substrate, so it can shatter coral reefs and damage the seabed. And that in turn has big impacts on the general productivity of the entire system. And it can take decades for coral reefs to recover from extensive blasting activity. In Tanzania, the explosives come either from the mining industry or construction sector, or they're homemade by mixing kerosene and fertilizer together. It's estimated that exploding a 1.5 litre water bottle would kill everything in a radius of 2 to 5 meters from the blast. And I just want to show you a short video so that you can see what this activity actually looks like.
Illegal and destructive fishing practices are a global problem. Their impacts threaten environmental sustainability and livelihoods worldwide. Destructive fishing gears capture non-target species and juvenile fish and can damage aquatic habitats. Dynamite fishing, in particular, can have long-lasting effects for reefs, fish, and people.
So the map on the right shows the location of Tanzania. It's a few degrees below the south of the equator in the Western Indian Ocean and East Africa, and it's bordered in the north by Kenya and in the south by Mozambique. And in Tanzania, blast fishing has been conducted at least since the 1960s, so over a period of about 60 years. And it's been widespread and indiscriminate, conducted out in the open with no attempt to hide it at all. It's amazing that there's still any fish left, to be honest. But part of being able to address this issue is understanding the patterns and where it occurs and what is driving it. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence on the number of blasts and the location of blasts from people who live along coast who are really interested to record this data. So there's previously, before 2014, there were figures like 100 blasts on a single day reported in Kilwa, or 8 to 9 blasts an hour in Mtwara, a peak of 25 per day near Dar. And those kind of figures are very, very useful, but they're quite anecdotal. And they give a hint of the scale of the problem, but that kind of fairly unquantified data is not the kind of data that is very persuasive for communicating with decision makers. So since 2015, there have been 3 different scientific studies that have been conducted that generated quantitative data on the occurrence of blast fishing in Tanzania. And they each allowed either the spatial comparison of blasting across the country or for detection of trends over time, or both of those things. And I'm going to summarize each of these one by one. The first one and the last one are both studies that I led, and the one in the middle is on this list is one that was led by another group, but I'm reporting on their data. So the first study I want to discuss is a survey that was conducted in 2015 that used a towed hydrophone array to document blast fishing along the entire coast of Tanzania. In fact, this was a cetacean survey that included the hydrophone to detect whales and dolphins. But when it came time to analyze the data analysis was led by Anya Wittich and a team from St Andrews. She found 3 times more the number of dynamite blasts than cetacean detections. And we realized that inadvertently, apart from doing a national survey of cetaceans, we'd actually also done a national survey of dynamite fishing. So the map on the right shows Tanzania. There's 3 major islands. In the north is Pemba, then in the middle is Zanzibar, and then further south is Mafia. And Dar es Salaam is the main city. I don't know if you can see my pointer here in the middle, which is a major port. And the black lines show the survey track of the boat. We did a sawtooth pattern from south, right near Mozambique, all the way up to the Kenya border. And we did nearly 2,700 kilometers of track line. And during that time recorded 318 dynamite fishing blasts. And we recorded blasts from the entire coast of the country. But if you see to the right of the map are the blue bars, those are a number of blasts detected standardized by effort in each half degree of latitude. And although there's blasting everywhere, clearly Dar es Salaam, that long blue bar in the middle, is by far the area most affected. And in fact, near Dar es Salaam, we recorded in a region of 10 blasts per hour and 70 blasts per day. And around 60, just over 60% of everything that we detected was within 80 kilometers of Dar es Salaam. And so this kind of national view allowed us to pick out the main hotspots. And I just want to play you a recording of one of the blasts. And you notice that it's a very sharp crack, followed by numerous echoes as the sound bounces off the surface and the bottom. So we looked for patterns in the data, and the top left graph shows the number of blasts recorded in each hour block of the day. And it was around 70% of all blasts were in the morning time between about 8 and 1. And then because we had two hydrophones in our array, we could get potential bearings to the origin of the blast. And the two maps on the right-hand side show close-ups of in the north. The top figure is Pemba, and the bottom figure is Dar es Salaam. And you can see that each of those dots are the location that the boat was when we heard the blast. And we coded them according to amplitude, so that the dark red ones were very loud blasts that we assume were close to the boat. And the very light pink blasts were very quiet and presumably quite far away. And so especially in the bottom figure, I don't know how easily you can see it, but I'm going to remove myself. You notice that the loudest blasts were all along the coast, and the further offshore you get, the quieter they were, and the bearing lines were all angled towards the shore. And similarly in Pemba, most of the loud blasts were along the Tanga coast, and the angle, potential angle showing where they occurred was also on the nearshore area. And so we assume from this what was already suspected, which is that most of the blasting occurs in the shallow nearshore zone, but that we were able to hear the blasts up to 30 kilometers away. This survey was significant because it was really the first scientific study to document the spatial extent of blasting across the entire country, and the first comprehensive scientific data showing the magnitude of the issue. And because it was a scientific study, it was hard to dismiss as being unrepresentative or biased. And I think probably independently, around the same time, there was a lot of international focus from the media and journalists on blast fishing in Tanzania. There was a National Geographic article and a short film and a lot of newspaper articles on the subject for the next couple of years. So moving on to the second study, in 2016, the Tanzanian Blast Monitoring Network was set up. It was a consortium of NGOs working on marine issues in Tanzania, included Sea-Sense, Bioacoustic Community Network, WWF Tanzania, and Sound Ocean Limited. That is Jason Rubin's organization. And working together, this group deployed land-based human observers to listen for blasts at 24 different locations along the Tanzanian coast, including 13 of the 16 total coastal districts. So very good spatial coverage. And those land-based recorders were out recording for nearly 2.5 years, from May 2016 until the end of 2018. And each recorder was asked to stand on the beach for a certain number of hours a day on certain days of the week and listen for blasts. Generally, you don't see them, but the sound travels much further. And so they're easier to hear than they are to see. And they estimate that they could hear blasts from 2 to 3 kilometers away, depending upon the weather. So they're monitoring a much smaller area than underwater acoustics, but it's still an acoustic survey of some sort. A phone app was developed, so each recorder had a smartphone with a phone app, and they would log their blasts on the app, and the data would be automatically transferred to and displayed on this website that you can see here. And there's a really nice interactive data portal where you can search for data according to a number of different criteria, including the district and the year, and whether or not the blasting was some people blast from on foot from shore. So if it was a foot fisher, or a fisherman in a motorboat, or a fisherman in an oar-powered boat. And the idea was that this data would be available very quickly after being detected, and would be available for the enforcement agencies to access. So based upon those 24 sites, the number of blasts per year were extrapolated to, and there was an estimate that in 2016 there were close to 42,000 blasts across all those locations. A huge number. In 2017, this dropped down to under 10,000 blasts in the same area. And then by 2018, there was a huge reduction, and there were only 465 blasts estimated, and there were no blasts at all documented during the final 4 months of the year. And they estimate that there was a 90% reduction in blast fishing during that period. So as I said before, up until this point, the fishers really had absolutely no concern about being apprehended or prosecuted, and blast fishing happened openly, and there were really no consequences and no concerns of being arrested. But things started to shift in 2015. The government established the MAT, Multi-Agency Task Team on Environmental Crime, which was a group composed of numerous different parts of the government, including the police and the Department of Fisheries. And combating this is very complex. Clearly, it's a security issue as well as a fisheries issue, and not something that the Department of Fisheries would have the capacity to be able to address alone. And so establishment of the MAT was very important in that it brought together a lot of different players to try to solve this problem. And clearly, it's not a good thing to have a lot of people wandering around the coastal zone with explosives. Financial support for the MAT was provided through an EU fisheries program, and at that time there was both EU funding and World Bank funding for fisheries development in Tanzania. Then a year later, in 2016, the Tanzanian President Magufuli announced a zero tolerance policy on blast fishing. And following on from that, for the following year or two, there were active interventions led by the Navy up and down the coast, targeting illegal fishers and fishing communities. And so that's the driving force behind this documented decline. So moving on now to the third acoustic study, which is one that we started in summer 2018, when blast fishing was already at really low levels. And in fact, the assumption in most places was that blast fishing had stopped and was no longer a problem. So we set out to put static acoustic recorders in the sea in areas that we knew were previous hotspots, where it was most likely to come back and begin again. And so the overall goal was to monitor the situation, because we expect it to return, as that's what's happened in the past, but to also take it to the next level, and this time to use more advanced devices that would allow us to actually locate the places where the blast explosions were actually happening, so that enforcement could be targeted in those areas. So on the map on the left, you see the red dots. We had 2 recorders in the north of the country and 2 in the south. Although there's 3 dots down there at the bottom, we only ever had 2 recorders down there at any one time. So 2 in Tanga and 2 in Dar es Salaam. And we had 3 hydrophones mounted on a triangular frame, as you can see in the picture. And the idea was that this would allow us to get accurate bearings to the origin of the sound, and that if we had 2 of those units deployed close to one another, that we would be able to locate the precise place that the blast occurred by intersecting or triangulating off both those units. So we made a triangular metal frame, which was 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. And these were sunk to areas between 20 and 25 meters in depth, so they were diveable to recover the devices. They were secured to the seafloor by concrete-filled jerry cans, so about 150 kilos of concrete. And you can see in the bottom pictures that on each tip of the triangular frame was a separate hydrophone, and they were a known distance apart from each other, so we could look at the time of arrival difference of the sound on each hydrophone. And they were on a 50% duty cycle, and in Tanzania typically our sound traps the memory seems to fill up almost always after about 50 days. So this, we still have recorders in the sea, but we've analysed the first year of data, so from summer 2018 to summer 2019. And the majority of this, the analysis was led by Jamie Macaulay, and I'm hoping that he's online. So if you have any specific questions about this part of the work, then he will be there to answer them, I hope. So we used a fairly simple automated detector in PAMGuard, and it had a fairly high false positive rate. So it detected the vast majority of bomb blasts, but it also detected a great number of other sounds. Jamie produced this program, SoundSort, to speed up the processing of the generated clips. So it allowed the clips to be visually sorted and listened and then confirmed by listening to all the potential blasts in each deployment. And this figure on the bottom left is all of the confirmed blasts from one deployment near Maziwe Island. And I just wanted to play you 2 more clips from that particular deployment, just to show the difference in the sound as, depending on how far away it is. So the first one is quite a distant blast. And the second one must have happened literally right over the top of our recorder. So looking at the data, we recorded 54 blasts during that first year. And so clearly, although everyone believed that blast fishing had stopped, a most significant result initially from our work is that it clearly continues in some places at low levels. The bottom left-hand graph shows the 4 recorders, so 2 in the north and 2 in the south. In the south, near Dar es Salaam, we only picked up 5 blasts in the whole year. And so it seems that it really has largely stopped in that area, which was the former hotspot. But up in Tanga, there's one recorder at Maziwe near Pangani, where we continue to pick up moderate levels of blasts throughout the entire year. There was no real pattern in blasting over time. We continued to see the same pattern of most blasts happening in the morning. And we also managed to analyze the data by tide and by moon and came up with some interesting patterns that we'd not seen before. 2/3 of all blasts were during low or falling tide, and more than half of all the blasts we detected were during spring low tides, and almost none during neap tides. And we think that's, I mean, fishing activity anyway is greater normally during spring tides. And I think when the environment is already quite degraded, it makes sense that yields would be higher when more areas are accessible during extreme low tides. So the map on the left is the recorder that had the largest number of blasts reported near to Pangani. And the yellow lines are the bearings towards the origin of the sound. And the circular, circle is 30 kilometers, which is roughly the distance that we think we can detect blasts. And so you see that there's a fairly consistent, it's fairly consistent that the majority of the blasts seem to be coming from the northeast of the recorder, not from the coast, which is the pattern that we saw before. And in fact, northeast in a sort of line parallel to the coast are offshore reefs, which are very shallow. And so we think that blasting is continuing on these offshore reefs that are about 15 kilometers from land. And also that happens to be inside Tanzania Marine Park. And so it's the pattern of blasting in the nearshore area seems to have shifted, and either to avoid detection, or maybe they always blasted in these areas and they've simply stopped blasting in the nearshore areas. But now the only places where we still see the blasting happening is in places where it's much harder to detect it and where they're outside of the range of anybody on shore from seeing or hearing them. Then the graph on the right, I overlaid the data that you already saw from the blast monitoring network and the land-based recorders. So the bars in the blue are the 2.5 years of data recorded from land, and then the little orange bars overlaid are the acoustic detections. And the two studies only overlapped for 6 months, but recorded had very similar results, and reinforce each other that blasting is still low. But interestingly, the acoustic recorders continue to detect blasts after the land-based recorders no longer were hearing any. And that's quite interesting. I mean, it makes sense to some degree in that the acoustic recorders, the fishermen don't know where they are, and they monitor a huge swath of the ocean, whatever the weather. Whereas these land-based recorders can only monitor near-shore waters. So I just wanted to compare and contrast these 3 different studies and the different acoustic methods that we have been used in Tanzania for documenting blast fishing. And they are each somewhat similar and complementary, but they have different strengths and weaknesses and different advantages and disadvantages that might make them better in different situations. So for example, the Tanzania Survey gave a really fantastic overview of the entire country in a fairly standardized way that really allowed for a spatial comparison and identification of the places where it's the biggest problem. The land-based human recorders is quite a different approach, which is quite flexible, fairly low cost, and the biggest advantage is that it generates data quickly and allows a detection of a blast and transmission of that information through to people who need to know very fast. And the static acoustic recorders are a useful tool because they can monitor such a huge part of the ocean from a single spot, and also allow for bearings and triangulation so that we know exactly which places the blasting occurred. And that allows for changes over time also to be detected. But on the downside, I think archival acoustic recorders, there's almost always going to be a delay between the recording of a blast and generation of the data and transmission of that data to the people that need to know about it. So that's one downside. Acoustic recorders are also quite expensive and prone to difficulty. But land-based recorders are also subject to biases which are quite difficult to quantify. They also monitor a very small part of the ocean in comparison to acoustic recorders. And unlike acoustic recorders, which fishermen don't know where they're located, land-based human recorders, it can be quite risky to be documenting illegal activities. So I think the key thing is that all of these different approaches provided quantitative data on this illegal activity. And although monitoring doesn't solve the problem, we're just documenting what's happening. I think in this instance, knowledge and data is power, and it did come with and improve our ability to communicate the problem and the scale of a problem in a way that I think spurred actions to combat it. So thank you very much. I have many people to thank. Many people have been involved with this work. It was funded by Code for Africa, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Gill, for your talk. We really enjoyed it. It's fascinating to see how incidental recordings can really become a very important conservation tool. So before I get into questions from you, I didn't tell our people and everybody listening who you are. So I'm going to just give a brief bio. So Gill has been involved in research on conservation of marine mammals in Southeast Asia and East Africa for around the last 20 years. Her primary work goal is to lead and catalyze conservation science on the most endangered species of marine megafauna in order to help prevent their extinction. She's currently a Marie Curie Fellow in the Scottish Oceans Institute at the University of St Andrews, UK, and was a Pew Marine Fellow from 2013 to 2016. A very accomplished woman, and we are very grateful to have her with us today. Hi, Gill, you can unmute yourself. I've got a few questions for you. Can you hear us okay?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And we look forward to the answers that you are about to give us. If you would like, you are more than welcome to share your video so that people can see you, but if that's not what you want to do, then that's also cool.
I'm trying. Here we go.
Perfect.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, welcome. Thank you so much. So the first question that we have for you is from Carl Smith, one of the Conservation Symposium people, and he says, for Gill, the blast fishermen, would they be artisanal fishermen who have changed fishing techniques or new entrants into the fishery? And following on from this, within the artisanal fishery, is blast fishing now socially acceptable?
So in Tanzania, the fishing sector is almost completely artisanal. So there's almost no like big commercial fishery, but there is small scale. I think one of the questions, yeah, small scale commercial, and I mean it's very accepted. It's been going on for so long, but it's clear people know that it's illegal, and there tends to be some dissent within each fishing community, and that it's the younger people that are more inclined to use dynamite, and the older fishers continue to use legal gears. And so it on a village by village basis, it can cause conflict. But dynamited fish are also not, they're kind of jelly-like because everything's shattered. So it's not a high cost product to sell. But there's definitely, it's all linked in with other illegal wildlife activities. So there's some involvement from outside the fishing communities to provide, there's often backing from other significant people providing some of the raw materials and a market for the goods. So it isn't necessarily just very small scale local. There's some other input to the whole system.
Thank you so much. We have another question. So Armstrong asks, does the presence of other relatively loud sounds affect the effectiveness of the detection and the frequency of the blasts?
So analytical things I defer to Jamie, but I can say we had, so on the map I showed you where we had 5 red dots where our acoustic recorders were deployed. Initially, we had one right near the Dar es Salaam port, and there's an offshore anchorage, and the recorder was quite close to the anchorage. And the background noise from the generators meant that it just that we couldn't detect. We don't know if we would detect. We didn't detect any blasts, but there was too much background noise to be able to do that. But everywhere else, where the units were really quite quiet.
Okay, thank you so much. We don't have time for any more questions right now, but Gill, if you can stay on for the Q&A at the end, I've got quite a few more questions for you to answer later. Just before up, we have Topher White. He is the CEO of Rainforest Connection, a company that uses acoustics to determine the presence of chainsaws and illegal logging in forests around the globe. So yeah, over to you, Topher.
Thank you. I'm actually trying to start the video. Not sure if I need to get permission for that. But hey, thanks a lot for coming to these great 2 talks before mine so far. I enjoyed listening to them very much.
I'm getting you sorted right now. I did see you flash up, so I know that it was working.
And I have to give credit to Ian and ShotSpotter for being an inspiration for a lot of this stuff. ShotSpotter is quite old school. They've been around for a while.
Sorry, we just, yeah, there we go.
There we go. Hi everybody. So I'm going to share my screen for a presentation. As mentioned, I'm Topher White from Rainforest Connection. We're a nonprofit tech startup based in San Francisco, Silicon Valley. And let's see, is everyone able to see? Nope, that didn't work. That's not what we want. Let's see whether we can get the right screen to be shared. One moment. We're basically trying to build technology and partnerships around the world to help fight deforestation and environmental protection. And somehow my screen isn't doing what I hope, but we'll get it shared if you guys will bear with me. Let's assume it's this one. And then we share it. Who sees Rainforest Connection screen?
You're all good. We can see it perfectly.
Okay, great. Yes. So again, I'm interested in Rainforest Connection. Again, our mission is to help protect rainforests around the world, but actually any ecosystem. And a lot of this comes from this idea, based on our experience, that sound, it's the sound of our living planet. The acoustics that we're all sort of here to talk about are the kind of greatest untapped resource for doing that. So again, if our mission is to protect these areas, there's lots of different ways that people will take on trying to protect areas. We've heard about some of them so far. Satellites, of course, are a very effective way to measure it. It's probably the most effective way for us to see what's happened around the world, to see where the deforestation is. Camera traps, community reporting, aerial surveys, and drones, of course, are a solution to almost everything. But our solution uses acoustics, as you can see, and so the very moment that a chainsaw is used in the forest, the sound is picked up by a device up in the trees, transmits through the cloud to people on the ground who get an alert on their phone, and they're like, what? And they jump on their motorcycles, and they get out there, and they stop the loggers in the act in this perfectly realistic rendition of exactly how it happens in the field. In order to do this, of course, we do need technology on the ground, as we were talking about. And so in this case, originally we used old smartphones, put them up in trees with solar panels and powerful microphones, so they're able to listen to all the sounds of the forest, pick it up, stream it up to the cloud, and of course do that. As mentioned before, there is cell phone service in a lot of the areas in the periphery of the forest. Of course, not everywhere, and we'll get to that later. But that's actually one of the most amazing things, is that you can protect the periphery, the most threatened part, using cell phone service. This is the first version of it being put together several years ago in the garage in Silicon Valley. It's a rite of passage for that. And here's one up on the tree with me putting it up there. But again, building something in San Francisco doesn't really mean much. Took it to Indonesia to test it into a gibbon reserve that was actually threatened by illegal logging. This was several years ago, back in 2013. put it up in the trees, and then on the second day we put it up there, actually picked up the sounds of chainsaws, and I just sort of wanted to show you this little video. You can probably relate to when you've been in the forest for like 2 days and suddenly it gets very, very real when you actually show up to try and stop the loggers on the other side of the hill. This was the very first time we ever were able to pick up the sounds of chainsaws and catch them in the act, really sort of 2 days into it. But this was actually quite effective, which we'll get into shortly. This is all about automated detection, so no one's listening, as you can see. This is what a chainsaw actually sounds like in a spectrogram. This should all be very familiar based on what you've seen. And of course, it's important to look at the way that this becomes a really telltale sign in the forest, even though the forest is, of course, quite loud, which we'll get to. But here's another example of how you use it, not just for chainsaws, taking it to Africa, to a place. This is actually a logging concession in Cameroon, where this road was actually, a vector for illegal exploitation of quite a few things. This is the one gate leading out from that road. These were the guys that were guarding it with all these endangered species that are behind it. And in fact, using the system, we were able to pick up the sounds of motorcycles on their way out in nighttime, and actually catch some folks on the way out. So I'm sort of jumping through these stories really fast so I can get into one in a little bit more depth. Before we actually do that, I want to back up for a second and talk about the organization as a whole. I don't really need to sell any of you on the concept of trying to protect these forests, but looking at kind of deforestation for what matters. Deforestation, of course, is the second largest contributor to climate change, more than all the transportation put together. And illegal logging, of course, doesn't make up for all deforestation, but illegal logging is up to 90% of the logging in the forest. And of course, not all deforestation comes from illegal logging, but it's so profitable in so many areas around the world because they'll go in and take out the most expensive trees that they can make so much money from that. They will cut a road into the forest to extract that high-priced lumber, and that road then becomes the vector for wholesale destruction, in this case Brazil, of the forest around it. So if you can stop the illegal logging, you can stop the roads. And of course, there's a mandate to stop illegal logging in a lot of places. And if you can stop the roads, you can stop the wholesale destruction, which might be the fastest way for us to fight climate change overall. So that's where our organization's mission comes in. And of course, we can build technology to make a difference. One of the biggest differences between us and, say, what you've heard about earlier is the disassociated nature of our partners. So rather than working with large national parks, we work with local groups, ones who are actually not paramilitarized. So this is one I'll get into a little more detail. This is a work we have in Brazil. If you look at Brazil, you'll see this sort of ocean of deforestation, but these islands of pretty intact forest. And actually in this forest, these are not protected areas, say like Kruger or the rest. These are actually indigenous reserves, areas where the indigenous tribes have been given the rights to protect their area by Brazil. But of course, they don't have a great deal of help in doing that. This is the Tembe territory. This red outline, it's about 2,500 square kilometers of forest. This is the Tembe tribe themselves. There's about 1,500 of them left, and they are entirely kind of stuck in these left and right areas because this purple area is entirely occupied by illegal loggers, drug cartels, and illegal settlers. And even just going from one town to the next, and again, these are just a tribe who lives in this area. Going from one town to the next, they'll run across full-scale logging trucks. The only thing they can really do in this situation is get out of there as fast as possible. And so you can see that their area, even though it is legally theirs, is entirely out of their control. At least it was in 2014 when we first got to know them. So the Tembe themselves, realizing this was an existential crisis for them, they got 30 young rangers, trained them, and put them together. This was not a government-trained force. These are not the police. These are the Tembe themselves in a lawless area, attempting to impose some degree of law and order, and that's of course what we depend upon. So let's look at what this actually looks like. So this area is huge. Cell phone service tends to extend about 15 to 20 kilometers, but if you're on the ground, not so much. Each one of these dots you see here is actually a cell phone tower. But even the distance from here to here is a good 10, 12 kilometers. And so in order to make this work, and of course with the local groups, this technology that you saw us building, we call them Guardians, these sensors, we got them to actually build them. So here's a video of the tribe actually helping to put together some of this hardware. And then to deal with getting it into an area where we could potentially make a difference, we ended up putting it high up in trees and teaching them to climb high into trees. Because up in trees, you're able to get better sunlight, so they can last essentially for forever. And of course, you get better cell phone service at great distance. So in this case, this one was one put along a road to detect trucks on the way in potentially, and chainsaws, and to pick up the sound, pick up the cell phone service from nearly 20 kilometers away. So again, just to recap on what the system is before we get into the example of this working, the moment a chainsaw goes off from the forest, picks up the sound, goes through the API, and sends an alert to local partners on the ground. So this is what this looks like in the interfaces of our system. This is, we are familiar. Everybody can hear the chainsaw here. But of course, this chainsaw is only at about 200 or 300 meters away. So this is a test that was done. In reality, threat detection is, you're looking at much greater areas. But that, of course, is one of the advantages of acoustics, is that you can hear things that are much further away. A camera trap, of course, can pick things up that are right in front of you, but as you all know, acoustics is great at picking up threats at great distance. So just to get into actual data from this area, this is an actual detection of a chainsaw from the area. Hopefully some of you can hear that. All of you can hear that. But it goes without saying that it's much more subtle. And this is where the use of convolutional neural network, AI, running in the cloud is really critical. So just to give a quick recap on this, the way our system works is that it will send all of the audio 24/7 up to the cloud, and we're actually doing that analysis in the cloud and sending a real-time alert within maybe 1 or 2 minutes to locals on the ground. These are those same Tembe rangers using a ranger app that we built for them. And this is what it kind of looks like. So they're able to get that alert within a couple of minutes of the chainsaw going off. They have the opportunity to listen and confirm that they agree with it. This gets fed back into our system, of course, so that we can improve the machine learning models. And then this allows them to dispatch. So of the sounds you heard, allows to lead situations much like this. We're able to get the Tembe scrambled altogether out to the end of this road to intercept this truck on the way out. So in fact, there were well over 30 rangers in that case, probably up to 40 or 50 at the end of the road.
Loaded up with wood.
And at the end of the road, of course, the Tembe were able to stop the loggers, seize the equipment, burn the trucks, to be honest, burn the other equipment that was there, and not so much arrest the loggers, so much as send them on their way. This is the extent to which they take the matters into their own hands, because there is no law and order in this area. There's no police, there's no military support, at least not originally, and so the Tembe themselves have to do this to protect their land, and of course, us, by working with them, they're able to carry out that mission for us. It's really important to us that nobody gets hurt, and so it's important that we get them to respond as quickly as possible and lower the stakes. But just to back up for a second, these guys, these are not, military police. They are not park guards. They're not trained in that way. They're just trying to protect their own land. But in doing so, they can have a huge impact on these issues that matter to the rest of us, would be climate change, would be protection of ecosystems. And so really, some of the best things that we can do is build tools to help these guys on the ground do it. I mean, this one guy may have a bigger effect on fighting climate change than a dozen engineers at Tesla or a clean tech company, just based on what they do. And so it's incumbent on us to make a difference. So you saw a few examples of us implementing this around the world. In fact, we put this into 14 countries across 5 continents already. And even now with COVID, of course, is majorly, is a big pressure on everyone. It's been hard to get into the field, but the need is increasing. The pressure on these environmental areas is definitely increasing. And so we are expanding into 5 new regions and fanning out across the world to expand into more over the next week. Here's some other examples of it being used. This one's in Peru. This one's back in Brazil. Here's Indonesia, where they're able to actually facilitate busts on illegal logging operations. So in all these situations, it's important to be producing evidence so the police can get involved, but these are not guards or police themselves. These are local communities that can be leveraged to make a difference. And that's the essence of our partnership. Cheap technology, existing infrastructure through cell phone networks and the ability to work with people who are already there to stop what amounts to illegal and destructive activity from which nobody benefits. But ultimately, a system like ours, where again, it is about that flow of audio data up through everything, is not just about catching threats. If you're doing this, you should be able to create every single guardian, every single device you put up in the trees, essentially is a live audio feed from these remote places. And so we've released this app that allows anybody around the world to kind of listen in and enjoy it. This one's been out for a while, and we figure a lot of this is about trying to build extra value in what's there. So thinking broadly about what this Rainforest Connection RFCX system is, we like to think of it as a nervous system for the natural world, right? It's not just about a device that's up there. It's not just about sending the alert to people to stop it. Those are just two ends of one system. At the end, it's about that flow, that workflow all the way through. How can we make audio into a rich way to understand what's there? It begins with sensation, capturing the acoustics, getting that up into a cloud API automatically and in real time, having it be organized and queryable. Perception is what we saw before. How do you perceive what's there? I perceive there's a chainsaw. I can hear a chainsaw, a gunshot, a vehicle. These are all the things you can do. But even that's not enough. Just knowing there's a chainsaw, just knowing there's a gunshot, doesn't amount to actionable intelligence. And so that's where cognition comes in. What does it all mean? So I sense it. We perceive there to be something that's there, all in parallel. The cognition tells us is really an additional higher level AI to help you figure out what is actually happening. What does it mean? And then, of course, the most important is response. We take responsibility for all four of these, and that's an increasingly difficult and creative thing to take on. But again, by virtue of all this, by automating all this, we are really attempting to show that this data can be used for so many different things, and we're going to talk about some of those. So this is the web dashboard that allows anybody to sort of see it. Here's a live feed, not live right now. We'll get into some demos in a bit. This is a feed of audio coming out of Sumatra. Nobody needs to be attuned to the spectrogram as you see here. But of course, within this, there's so much more. This that you see right here is actually a vehicle, but there's a lot of other stuff happening in this spectrogram that we would like to leverage the same system to apply at scale. And that's where this interface that we will show in a little bit makes it possible for anybody while using it to annotate data right there. So if you happen to be somebody who's listening for chainsaws, and you can, of course, annotate for gibbons. Every single one of those labels, annotations, can then be fed directly into a pattern matching system in a tool called Arbimon that we make for scientists and bioacoustic professionals for free. That's what this is. That pattern matching, which by the way, you should all use this for free. We just released it for free 3 weeks ago. Just by annotating a single one, you can sort of search through your entire data set, whether it be an hour, a month, a week, a year, all that stuff. It makes it very fast to search through it, pull out these examples of those calls. And when you're able to do this across a few species, then interfaces like this become possible. So in this case, of course, we are detecting those threats from vehicles, but it becomes very easy to build neural networks to recognize different species all at once across these spectrograms. And we're all about trying to build these experimental interfaces to make more sense of what's there. Because we can alert people to threats, but actually getting people to pay attention to the subtleties of what's happening can lead to so much more. So for example here, of course, we're showing that there are a few species. There's a vehicle and a few species that are here. Again, there's probably more within it that we want to pick out. But the extent to which we're able to go very, very precise, down to the second, and say this is the way in which the species are making calls at the same time, suddenly we're able to look at ecology at that very precise level, and then extrapolate it out to an hour, to a week, to a year, and actually look at this very, very precise data in a big data sense. And what are the ways in which species overlap or don't? What are the ways in which certain species avoid each other? What are the ways in which certain species affect each other? They're able to look at ecology of the forest in a big data sense and potentially see seed hypotheses. And of course, this leads to a greater sort of mission undertaking for us, which is to say, we can hear chainsaws, we can hear gunshots, But not every hunter makes noise when they're walking through the forest. Not every tiger or jaguar makes noise. If we want to be able to hear what's there, we have to listen to the animals that are making noise, to hear the things that they're telling us about what's happening. So here's a very brute force example of that, because we're still very early in this. But essentially to say that when these things are, even things that don't make noise, if I were to walk through the forest, I'm going to be pretty quiet, but you can be sure the other animals are talking about me. That's the extent to which we'd like to make use of these sort of fabric of the noise of these ecosystems to tell what's happening there. So here's an example. This is a project in Costa Rica where we're listening for spider monkeys. Spider monkeys are a critical animal in this ecosystem. They spread seeds, seed dispersal, and they're also critically endangered. But they also make lots and lots of noise during the day. And so there was, in fact, an instance where suddenly we were getting lots and lots of spider monkeys making noise at night. That didn't make a whole lot of sense. And it turned out that there was, in fact, a big event that occurred at night that woke them up. There was an earthquake in Costa Rica, as you can hear here. They began to shake the trees around. And again, as you saw these guardians up in trees, you can really hear the trees shaking. And that earthquake lasts for about 15 seconds, at which point all the spider monkeys wake up and begin yelling to each other for the better part of an hour. So again, this is very brute force. This is an example of an event that occurred we never would have known about if we hadn't seen some anomalous animal behavior in our system and gone to look for it. That's the sort of thing we'd like to take very precise to be able to look for other threats, whether it be hunters or other sorts of threats to the forest. And being able to measure the increases or decreases in biological activity over time is really about our impact measurement. If we hope to stop illegal logging and actually protect these areas, we have to make sure they're being legitimately measured, measuring our impact over time as well. So again, going back to this idea of a nervous system for the world, this is the technical sort of overview of what that really means. It really is very cloud-based. We do, of course, build a number of apps to get into. It's all about how do we get data, heavy data. This was mentioned earlier. Acoustic data is heavy. How do we get this out of the most remote places up into our system and organize it, analyze it very quickly, and bring it back? But then on top of that, how do we make that data available in rich interfaces that you just saw so it can continue to be useful beyond the actual moment? But in doing this, it means that by building all this into this sort of cloud API sense, we're not necessarily limited to the sensors that we create. So here's an example of another project that we have in Vancouver. Again, we don't build hydrophones. We don't work underwater, but we did build a cloud-based system that allows audio to flow in, to run on analysis, and for insights to be spit out more or less in real time. So here's an example of a DFO, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada, who's streaming audio from Vancouver Bay. This is the city of Vancouver, very large city. But orcas and humpbacks frequently come into this area, and you know, it's important to know that so they can clear the shipping channels. So based on those streams that are coming in, you can see that this is actually, it alerted us, and then the moment that orcas were able to come in, orcas came into this area, they were able to get an alert on the app the exact same way those indigenous rangers in Brazil did, and go out and actually clear this lane. And this is an example of good collaboration. So we didn't build this detection model. Google did. They had an engineer at Google that built a humpback and orca detector. We didn't create the audio stream. That was done by the government in Canada, in Vancouver. And we also didn't deal with the response. We just facilitated all these pieces coming together to achieve impact. And that's what we hope to do. So again, our main bread and butter is, of course, terrestrial acoustic monitoring in remote places. These are the areas that we are sort of existing in throughout the world right now. We're hoping that all of these tools, this whole platform, becomes a way by which scientists and bioacoustic people can start to worry about the actual science and not the amount of data that they have. But just based on our actual monitoring, of course, we will, over the next year, we hope to triple our impact with 6,000 square kilometers forest more, and increasingly just the amount of data that we're gathering, almost this audio Noah's Ark of what the ecosystems, how they exist right now. There's so much golden stuff within that, and we're saving all of it to make it available to scientists, including you. And so I hope we can, you can actually talk more about how you might use this platform, and of course how you think we should improve it. Beyond actually just sort of showing you slides, I'd also love to be able to give you little demos of this sort of platform in and of itself, since we have extra time, because I speak rather quickly. And if you have any questions, you can interject with that right now, because at the end of the day, you know, my background is not in ecology. My background is not even really in conservation until this organization. It's really much more in physics and software engineering, and that's the specialty of our actual team. So how is it that, why can we not take these huge data sets, like the ones of decades upon decades of audio, and make them available in a rich interface just like this, so that almost like the Google Earth for time series acoustic data? How would you explore that? So we can, as you saw in the other interface, how we can interlay species detections right over top of that. And at the same time, you know, if you want to really get in there and explore, these are gibbon calls. I love Sumatra, by the way. But really can sort of zoom in and really see what's there, or zoom out and view these things over a longer period of time. Here's an example of the exact same killer whale model that you saw. Again, killer whales don't show up in Vancouver all the time. They show up pretty rarely. In fact, they only show up maybe a couple times in a year. There's no way that people are going to be able to sit around and listen for it. But because we're running all these analytics on incoming data at every given moment, it's very easy for us to map it out and say, wow, these are the moments when those whales actually showed up. These are the moments when there was super gathering. Same for humpbacks. These are the moments when humpbacks came in. To do that analysis like all at once would actually be difficult, but because we're doing it in real time, it's pretty fast. And again, to make interfaces that allow someone to really explore what's there, that's what we're trying to do. So again, this is also a Sumatran feed. This one's relatively real time. Let's give it a slightly different spectrogram. These are all very early interfaces that we want to make available. But by the same token, I can zoom in here and say, I know this is a gibbon call. Well, let's wait for it to load up a little bit. It's a little slow. Meanwhile, I will search for, let's see, I love Siamangs. And anybody, whether it be a citizen scientist or the rest, can suddenly be able to sort of annotate this data. And then the moment that annotation is made, it can be kicked off into the Arbonne interface to suddenly scan the entire database for it. And it gets better the more annotations that we have, but the idea is to simplify the gateway into insight in the data, and to build cool, fun interfaces for getting there. But going back to threat detection for just 1 second, pardon me. These are the ways by which we can look at it. So even if it is a gunshot. So for example, last week, let's see, on the 27th of October in Sumatra, gunshots were detected in the forest, which is actually quite novel. You can hopefully hear that. These are the interfaces that allow our partners to actually review and confirm these things. By the same token, you can see, let's look for chainsaws that went off over the same period of time, over the past 2 weeks, and becomes a collaborative platform. Again, nothing fancy. Doesn't need to be too fancy, but we know that our partners on the ground are reviewing it and confirming that, yes, this was a chainsaw. And the moment that they confirm that, it's on them to actually respond. And so that's the two-way communication, similar to what was described in ShotSpotter. The two-way communication for making sure that they make the most of that. There are still chainsaws happening right now in Bukit Banyo, like for example, just over the past few hours. And so our team is following up with them on the ground right now to make sure that something is being done about this, or that they have chosen explicitly not to. So ultimately, no solution for detection is entirely sufficient for stopping it. But it's that real-time information and the two-way communication with the partners that makes the difference. Yeah, I guess I can go into some other examples, but all I can say at the end is that for you scientists and bioacousticians out there, these platforms are entirely free. You may have a year of audio or 1 hour. Put it in and use it and let us know how you can pull what you want out of it, and we can build these tools together. And also, by the way, here's one example of the same Guardian. I think I did actually leave it on. So in the same interface, you can see, you can hopefully hear me giving my talk again. The rights to protect their area by Brazil, but of course they don't have a great deal of help in doing that. This is the 10-bit. So it just kind of goes to show how more or less real-time this system is, even whether it be from the remote rainforest or whether it's from right here at the computer, a device that's being held up. So the cheaper we can make the hardware, the more connected we can make it so that people can focus on the insights and the difficult problems and not just how to move bits and bytes around. That's what we're focused on, and hopefully we can do it with you. Thanks.
Hi, oh my word, that was an amazing talk. We in the office have just been so blown away by the technology that you're using, and the fact that it's open source is really speaking our love language as scientists. So before I talk to Topher, cool story. I actually found out about Topher on a podcast I was listening about conservation technology, and your name came up, and that's how I looked you up, and I'm so glad, so glad that I did. The work that you're doing is just, it's incredible. So I have a few questions from you from our listeners. I said that like a podcast, but we're not, we're in a conference, so I'll carry on. So we have one from Carly who says, what if the local communities are the ones engaging in the illegal activities themselves? So in the case of that tribe in the Amazon, what if part of the community is against and for the
It's a great question. So that is often the case, but usually it's not universal. So the most effective places are areas where there's like a large scale black market illegal logging taking place that you can disrupt. Those are the areas where you can have the most impact. But almost every community is going to have some people within it who are part of that network as well. But the idea is to engage with the leadership. The leadership has the ability to influence that otherwise, and most of the times it's a pretty thankless job to be involved in that if you're not at the very, very high levels. So it's the idea is to make it difficult for them and to make sure the community themselves are taking responsibility for stopping it. But every different region is totally different when it comes to what the problem is and what the potential solution is. And it's not our job to create the solution, just to build the tools they ask us to.
Cool. Thank you so much. We want to, there's another question here. Can you detect humans by, say, a sudden lack of noise, or perhaps alarm calls that animals are well known for?
So we think that, that those are the things that we need lots and lots of data to do. We need to be able to line up our years of audio with camera trap information that says, I strongly believe that there are going to be specific alarm calls, specific fluctuations that can be associated with like a jaguar or a tiger or a person. Maybe it's all the same. But for now, it'll probably be alarm calls that alert us to people in instances. That's what we're going for. But again, we're just embarking on that journey right now. We have enough data, and we have an awesome science team, and we have an awesome science community, and you guys to help us achieve that, I hope.
Cool. One more question, and then I think we'll go into our open panel discussion. This is from Daniela, and she's saying, this is absolutely visionary. Could you give us an idea of false positive or negative rates for your detectors?
So our false positive rates were horrible for a long, long time. And that was the biggest thing holding us back, because you can only send so many alerts to somebody. And they can, and like you saw in the app, they can review it and say, that's not a chainsaw, I'm not going to respond. But, and that's good. They don't run off into the forest to stop somebody, but they also stop paying attention to alerts. So a lot of what we've been doing over the past few years is to get a little bit better every time. And now the false positive rates are quite good. So sometimes it helps to not be overly sensitive. It doesn't necessarily always help to hear chainsaws that are 1.5 kilometers away if you can hear them more reliably closer up. So our false positive rates are very, very low now. I think that there's maybe one out of every like 20 alerts that are not they're not real. But we also have a unit in our team right now that is going to be receiving alerts as well as people in the field, similar to what was described by the ShotSpotter talk.
Cool, awesome. Thank you so much.
Somebody asked about the size of the hardware. We don't have the solar panels, but we're essentially, this is an entire kit required to put an entire station up in the tree. So hopefully we'll get to the point where we can start shipping these out to people to do it entirely themselves. If you want to be a part of that, please contact me.
Cool. Thank you so much. So we're going to go into a more general Q&A session now. And so this is, well, first of all, thank you so much to Gill, Ian, and Topher. We really loved this time with you guys. So to start off our general sessions, I would just like to ask each of you, from your own experiences, what are the greatest limitations to implement this work for in areas that are under-resourced? So maybe Ian, we'll start with you.
Under-resourced. So, I mean, I think Topher and Gill have both touched on this. Technology is only as good as your response. So you can have the best technology in the world and put as many dots as you like on a map to say bad guys here, but unless you can get to those people in a quick enough time, it becomes an exercise in academia at best, and in fact just frustrates you. So I think the biggest challenges, and I think we're quite, in some ways, fortunate, and Topher touched on this, the Kruger National Park is perhaps an exception to the rule as far as this kind of problem is concerned, because they are particularly well-resourced or fairly well-resourced. I mean, there's helicopters, there's very well-trained rangers, there are systems and processes in place to deal with this kind of thing. And all we're doing is closing that time and distance gap on the bad guys. So a lot of what already existed in terms of response capability, we were just able to make that better by giving them the kind of information that would put them on the location a lot faster. So, but I think and a lot of the problems, I think, vary depending on where you're going, whether it's fish blasting, whether it's illegal logging, etc. But it really does boil down to putting a dot on a map and giving a location. You still need to send a man there. And I think a lot of the challenges there revolve around government support, funding. And I think truthfully, that is it. Government support and funding to make these things really effective. Those are the challenges that we have to overcome. And even the project that we did up in the Kruger, that was funded by a philanthropist, from the US. And I think that unfortunately is the reality, is that in many of these countries, and I think Topher and Gill will attest to this, conservation is the luxury of the rich, truthfully. And when you're living in countries that are plagued with unemployment, poverty, malnutrition, limited healthcare, from a political perspective, it's often very, very difficult to motivate governments to fund things that are not impacting on people's stomach, health, and employment. And I think that is probably the biggest challenge that we find right now, is that the very nature of these problems exists. They exist because of poverty. And when you have poverty, it's hard to activate government resources to address it, because they have so many other problems on their hands that they have to cope with. So I would say that funding and government, although there is definitely good intentions, I think the ability to get the kind of momentum that you'd need in terms of government support, that is probably the biggest challenge that we find. And as I said, we're quite lucky that we operate in a relatively well-resourced, well-managed, very protected reserve. And I think, but Topher and Gill will probably speak to their experience being far more complex than ours as far as resources and funding are concerned.
Thank you so much. Gill, do you have anything to add with your experiences in this realm? Sorry,
muted.
Gill, you are still muted. If you can unmute.
Thank you. I would concur very much with that viewpoint. I mean, in Tanzania, I mean, it's the situation is interesting. So when we first got some funding to do this monitoring, there was sort of a debate about whether or not that was really the best use of those funds, because there was absolutely no funds available for enforcement or actually doing anything. And so it made sense that if you have limited funds, monitoring is maybe not the most important thing to be doing. But the issue in Tanzania, partly with blast fishing, I mean, it's an interesting case study in some ways, because it doesn't happen in Mozambique, it doesn't happen in Kenya, and so the driving forces behind it, there's a lot of social and political aspects to why it happens there and why it doesn't happen in other places, why it's not tolerated in other places. And one aspect of it is that it's really not considered much of a crime. And also, so the penalties are very, very small. And judges have not really typically perceived it as being much of a problem. And because of the corruption, I guess, you know, even people who were occasionally apprehended or basically never, ever were convicted. And so, you know, we can throw technology at the issue of detecting blasts and having, I mean, in other places I know, in other situations, you know, being able to detect a blast and then communicate that location straight to the police or to the marine police. Technologically, we can do that. But you can sit on the beach and watch people blasting anyway. So it's just, that's not going to solve the problem at all. It's entirely takes political will. And so in the end, what happened in Tanzania is that the situation shifted politically, and the Navy were deployed to do interventions along the coast. And with the naval involvement, that was the only thing that caused that actually stopped it. And so I think, you know, you can use technology to give you more information, but really in the end, solving these issues, it's a human political problem.
Yeah, I would only add to that quickly without trying to reiterate stuff. I will say that of all the places that we've worked, and we've worked the least in Africa, it does seem to be the most complex, most difficult place to deal with some of these, some of the societal issues that are there, at least. But at the same time, you do have, in the case of Kruger, you have very, very well managed parks and very well and solid teams. Well, for us, I would say that the biggest thing staying in our way is that the technology on its own can be as awesome as you want it to be, and people can be as sincere as they are about actually using it, but in the moment they probably won't. So especially if they're not paramilitarized, if they're not police, even if they are police, they won't necessarily respond. There has to be some kind of accountability that goes both ways. We have accountability to them and them to us. When something happens, there's a discussion and a decision is made to go there. Nobody can be counted on to take a sort of life-threatening risk just by getting information. And sometimes that involves us having to support them or others.
I suppose it does come down to a little bit of having to provide some incentive to the community for, you know, acting in a way that is promote conservation in the scenario.
Totally. This surprised me. That really surprised me. I really, because people were telling us, if we have this, we'll fix it. Then they had it and they weren't doing it. And, you know, it really is a harsh judgment on what we do if what we do is not sufficient to fix it. So it turns out that a lot of what we can do is that relationship with people. So the technology is less than half the equation, unfortunately.
Yeah. I think, so that was actually leading into my very next question, which is any issues dealing with cultural beliefs or traditions that may impact how the local communities view these practices, whether it's poaching, whether it's logging, whether it's blast fishing, and how these may impact your action in those realms, or how it may hinder you. So is there any experience? I mean, Topher, you said that part of what you're doing is you're involving the communities in the area, but it can sometimes be difficult.
We have to involve communities in the area because I can't just show up and tell people to stop logging. They're the only ones who can do that and make a difference. And we only go play where we're invited to, so they'll invite us in to do projects. We have not, to be honest, we have not really gotten into real community support. Except in the case of the Tembe tribe, we'll actually fund ranger patrols, but that's a major exception. Beyond that, but we think at the end of the day, we want to prove that there's a value in this data. If we can get as many people interested in what's there, like if these bioacoustic streams and scientists are using it, and there's like, what if that becomes a whole resource that can be pushed back to the community? We're not that far from being able to pilot that in a few exceptional places, because otherwise the only resources they can get from the forest are natural ones, are the extractive ones. So that's what we're trying to prove. But we have to make it interesting. We have to make the data interesting to people.
Ian, do you have any sort of like community involvement in the work that you do? How have you found trying to involve the people in the area?
Well, we haven't really gotten involved in that side of it. I mean, I know that certainly from the Kruger's perspective, there are various initiatives, and General Jooste during his time in the Kruger often used to make the comment that the battle to save the rhino will be fought and won outside the fences. You need to convince people of the value of these creatures being alive as opposed to being, dead. And but I suppose then again, it just comes back to the realities of the developing world and poverty and hunger and unemployment. And I've often said this, as much as it pains me to say it, I sort of get it. If I was hungry and my kids were hungry and I had no job and no prospect of getting one, and somebody asked me to go and do the unthinkable and shoot a rhino and dehorn it, I would have to be a very big man to turn that down. We sit in a position of privilege. We eat 3 meals a day, and we sleep in warm beds and live in nice homes, and we cast judgment on people who don't have that privilege. So I think it's often difficult to, the bigger issue here is certainly inequality, poverty, unemployment. Those are the big challenges, and if we can solve those problems, then people start to see value in something. But if somebody puts a rifle in your hand and says, "I'll give you 100,000 bucks if you come back with a horn," a very hard thing to turn down. And that's just the hard reality of it. You and I might not like it, but that is just what it is. We don't get involved in a lot of the community stuff, and I think that therein lies the opportunity. Is if you can empower and enrich, well, not enrich, but empower and uplift communities that surround these areas. That is the thing that takes away the incentive, because people with full stomachs are less likely to take the kind of risks that are involved in, and certainly in the Kruger's case, the risks are serious. You get caught on the wrong side of that fence with a rifle in your hand, life gets interesting. But nonetheless, people are willing to take those risks because the alternative, in terms of their day-to-day lives, means that they're willing to take those risks. And I think that is the bigger challenge in terms of community involvement, is how do you feed people? Because poverty and environmental destruction are two sides of the same coin.
Okay, moving on to a more technical question. We have a question here from Carly, which is directed at both Ian and Topher. She says, what about areas where you don't have cell phone service, or even where GPS can have a wide error margin? Where she works in Madagascar, that is the case, and how do you mitigate that? I'm going to direct this at you, Ian, first, and then Topher, you can chip in with.
Well, the short answer, it's a very quick one. Without GSM or without comms, I want to specifically pick on GSM, but without comms, we've got nothing. And GSM just happens to be the best and most available and cheapest form of communication. Satellite communication is extremely expensive, and therefore probably just kills these projects before you start. As far as GPS accuracy is concerned, we haven't seen it, or not to the extent where it has affected our ability to detect and locate gunfire. But of course, if in the scenario where we didn't have GPS accuracy or unreliable GPS data, where your PDOP starts to flop all over the place, we need accurate GPS location in terms of the sensors in order to accurately locate the shot. So without comms and without GSM or GPS accuracy, well, then the system, it won't work for the obvious reasons.
Yeah. I mean, so in our case, we're not so focused on the hardware. We build hardware, but at the end of it, it's all about the software, right? And the software you can run on it. And so in doing that, we have a lot of flexibility. And so we are rolling out a version that'll be available January, February person in Brazil that uses satellite connections to send it. It won't be able to stream audio over the satellite connection. It's just not possible. But it'll do onboard analysis using models you put in there. So for threats or certain species you're looking for, and it'll send regular reports every day. And you can talk back to it and control it. So that's become available on the Iridium system, which is a very, very limited system, but is more or less available everywhere. And then the other thing we have, if you really want to get data payloads like audio off, we partner with an organization called, I forgot the name. Anyway, we can have drones swing by and pick up the audio data wirelessly. But again, you have to do that like once a day to really get like 24 hours of audio.
Thank you so much for your answer. I have a question directed at Gill. So it says, hi Jill, lovely talk. Do you think that the reduction in dynamite fishing over the study was directly related to your listening in? And if so, what is the condition like now? Is the work continuing to check law enforcement? So Joel, if you can unmute yourself and yeah, thank you.
Sorry, could you say the question again?
Sure. So it says, do you think that there's a reduction, that the reduction in dynamite fishing over the study was directly related to your listening in? And if so, what is the condition like now? And is the work continuing to check enforcement of?
No, I don't think it was directly, the monitoring data was not directly linked with the reduction in blasting. The fishermen, in all cases, the fishermen were not aware that we were monitoring in any of the 3 studies that we did. I mean, the acoustics is all, fairly low. No one would really notice that happening. And the land-based recording was done very specifically to protect the people who were involved. So they were unaware that there was any monitoring going on. The reason it declined is absolutely because the government established a special task team to lead the interventions, and the Navy got involved. But we still have acoustic recorders in the sea, and I mean, so there was one 5-year period in the past where blasting stopped after naval interventions, and after 5 years it started up again and ended up just as widespread as before. So we anticipate that may well happen again. But I think there was another question, I think, as to whether fishermen understand that this is unsustainable. And I think my hope, and maybe I'm a bit naive, is that it's really clear now that the blast fishing has stopped for about 3 years that things are improving. I mean, you can see it even when you go diving, that the habitat is recovering. And my hope is that will demonstrate to people that, when you actually stop, look how things do in fact improve. So, yeah.
I had a follow-up question, whereas I saw in one of your graphs that there was quite a dip in the number of blasts detected in the beginning of 2017. So is that when intervention occurred by the Navy, or what was the reason for that dip? I may have missed it though.
Yeah, no, and I think actually that was, the funding stopped temporarily and the land-based observers were not recording. So you can just fill that in with the general trend.
As happened with science in most of the world.
Yeah.
I think we have a time for one more question. I'm going to direct this one at Ian and Topher again. First, it's a two-parter. First, how are the sensor devices powered? But I think you guys both mentioned that solar power was your go-to in that sense, but you can elaborate more on that. And the second part was, how large are the sensors, and do they have to be deployed into trees? Or are there opportunities to cryptically hide them in the ground, for example, in areas where tall vegetation is very scarce, assuming that they're talking about in savanna areas or grasslands and the like?
I'll start, Topher. Yep, I think what Topher has shown is his sensors. We specifically do not put what our sensors look like in the public domain because we don't want them targeted. But to give you an idea, it's sort of like the size of a small toaster is probably the best way to describe it. We do run on solar. Ours is a 12-volt solar system, and we run on a 35 amp hour battery, which, for those who don't know what that is, it's sort of pretty much the size of a standard car battery, and a 50 watt solar panel, which is approximately 2 foot by 2 foot in size. Where we have trees, we use them, but where we don't have trees, we also have a very lightweight collapsible mast system that can break down into a kit that we can fit into the back of a vehicle or into a helicopter, that deploys quite literally with the only tool that you need is a hammer, that we're able to essentially stake it into the ground and support it so that it can be freestanding in an open savanna area where you don't have trees. As far as underground deployment is concerned, that's not an option for a host of reasons. Number one, comms tends not to work very well on the ground and certainly worse underground. And from an acoustic perspective, you want as much height as you can have or get in order to get the best possible acoustic propagation. The higher you are, the more likely you are to hear it because there's less things that can interrupt the sound. So I hope that answers the question.
Yep. In our case, the solar power is the single biggest engineering challenge overall, is getting things to generate power. Because again, we're streaming audio 24/7, which takes a tremendous amount of power. In some cases, if we don't have enough power, we can't do that. So that's why we go high in trees, because trees are really good at catching all the light they can. And so we try and get as much sunlight up there as possible. In places where there wasn't a canopy, you wouldn't need to put them that high up. You could put them further down. They would be prone to being stolen, but we put them in trees that, you could scurry up, that are just 3 or 4 meters high. And that's in South Africa because there aren't tall trees where we are on the cradle of humankind. But aside from that, I would say we did have one incident. Of all the hundreds we put up, we've only had one that was ever found and stolen. It tracked the GPS location, went and bought it back. That was in Cameroon. See, everything is even more resourceful in Africa than in the rest of the world.
Our biggest challenger, just as an aside, in terms of sensors being lost, is actually not humans, it's elephants. Elephants are the best description I've had of them yet is an elephant is a 5-ton 2-year-old. So when it finds a new toy, it's going to break it and carry it away somewhere where you can't find it. So that is our biggest risk, funny enough, to our sensors, is elephants sticking their tusks through our solar panels.
Yes, I remember earlier today we also had a comment about how elephants steal things that they find them curious or interesting. Okay, I'm going to wrap up there. Guys, this has been absolutely amazing. We have so many questions for you, but we will post them to you either via email or on the app. Just wow, this has been super, super cool. I've been looking forward to this all week, and you have not disappointed. So big round of applause to all of you guys from our team here in HQ.